Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Five biggest question marks for this Clemson program heading into 2024. And many of you guys know this team, at least in my mind, one of the more fascinating programs that we see across the country. And if these five question marks get answered by Clemson in the 2024 year, you make no mistake about it, this is one of the most dangerous teams that we see in college football. But before we get into these five specific questions, kind of the nitty gritty of this Clemson roster, I want to start with just an overarching question. And that is, what happens if Clemson reaches their potential in 2024? Because I look at this roster and it's classic kind of clown Clemson season in the national media, right? It's a program that doesn't use the transfer portal. And during the offseason, there's a lot of talking heads that kind of just like to talk negatively about Clemson and not recognize the aspects of this program that make it extremely good heading into 2024. I look at this roster and say, you got a former five-star quarterback that's going into year two as a starting quarterback, year two in the Garrett Riley offense. You have an offensive line that, although at times was inconsistent in 2023, has a lot of returning production coming back. And that's something that just not a lot of programs have in this era of the transfer portal. It's always new faces on the offensive line. I look at Clemson's offensive line and say, a lot of these guys have played together for the last couple of years. I look at the wide receiver room and say, yeah, it hasn't put it together yet on a consistent basis, but it is extremely talented. You have two former five stars coming in as true freshmen. You have one of the best running backs in the ACC in the backfield. And on top of all that, this defense is going to be a top 10 unit that we see in the country. This Clemson team is so much more dangerous than a lot of people recognize because, again, all people want to talk about surrounding this Clemson program is Dabo Swinney not using the transfer portal. Do I necessarily agree with that? I certainly don't. I've been vocal about it, but that doesn't mean we just ignore all the very bright spots that you potentially have for this Clemson team. Now, in order for Clemson to reach their potential, they got to answer these five questions. Really excited to get into it. Before we do, and as always, just want to say thank you to you guys, to the Clemson fans. I always get a ton of great feedback from you guys in the comment section. I learn a ton from you guys. Can't thank you guys enough. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Would love to hear some questions that you guys have about this Clemson program as well. And without further ado, let's get into it. And let's start with number one. And that is, do we see the Garrett Riley offense in 2024? I go back to 2023. I've watched these Clemson games back so many different times. I've looked at the numbers, and my conclusion is that just wasn't the Garrett Riley offense. And I know they had some quarterback play that struggled. I know they had some wide receiver play that they were injured. They were struggling. There's no question marks about that. But I kind of compare what we saw from Garrett Riley in the 2022 season to what we saw in Clemson in 2023. It is massively different, right? Clemson really struggled to generate explosive plays. They averaged 4.9 yards per play. That was 106th in the country. They only had 46 plays all year that went for 20-plus yards. You go back to the TCU offense that we saw in 2022, TCU had 91. They were top 5 in the country in 20-plus yard plays. Clemson was outside of the top 90. And then you look at the passing attack. I mean, Max Duggan in 2022 for TCU, 18% of his attempts went 20-plus yards down the field. You look at Clemson and Cade Klubnik last year, only 9%. I mean, it just wasn't the Garrett Riley offense that a lot of us expected. And I don't necessarily know what's to blame. If Dabo Swinney was maybe having a little bit more control of the offense than we thought, I think that might be it. One of the biggest question marks for this Clemson offense is, do we get the Garrett Riley offense that we saw in TCU in 2022, an explosive offense that's pushing the ball down the field, that's getting it to its playmakers in space? If you can find that, again, I think if you get the Garrett Riley offense in 2024, Clemson is the favorite to win the ACC. Now, that's a massive question mark, and that's a question mark we need to see answered in the fall. That being said, this Clemson team can be really, really good if we see this offense take a step. And again, there are a lot of reasons to believe that we see this offense take a step, right? Cade Klubnik going into year 2 as a starter. You have a much healthier and more dynamic wide receiver room than last year. And ideally, the offensive line just stays a little bit healthier than it did last year. Number 2 question, and arguably just as important as this Garrett Riley offense, is what wide receiver breaks out, specifically working downfield. I look at pass catchers like Antonio Williams, Tyler Brown, Jake Bringenstool at the tight end position and say some of the better pass catchers in the ACC, but where do they necessarily thrive? It's those short intermediate route trees. It's creating separation underneath and kind of being those separators at the wide receiver position. You got to have those kind of wide receivers. Now it makes it really hard for those wide receivers to find a lot of success when they're not paired up with a wide receiver that can win vertically. Because you go back and watch that Clemson film, and we kind of talked about it, just not pushing the ball down the field. Cade Klubnik, only 9% of his attempts going 20 plus yards down the field, and say a lot of these defenses were just kind of scrunching down on this Clemson offense. It made it hard to run the football because you saw safeties in the box, and it made it hard to get the football to guys like Tyler Brown and Jake Bringenstool because, again, a lot of this coverage is squeezing down into those route tree concepts that those wide receivers like to run. You got to have a wide receiver that can emerge as a threat down the field. Now, Cade Klubnik certainly needs to get better at pushing the ball down the field, but you go back to last year, they didn't have a single wide receiver that started significant time that had an average depth of target of 10 plus yards down the field. I mean, there just wasn't a wide receiver that Clemson trusted to push the ball down the field to. I look at this roster and say, you got some guys that certainly could play that role. They just need to step up, right? I think it's headlined by Adam Randall. Going into year 3, this kid has all the physical traits to be an elite boundary wide receiver. You're bringing five-star wide receiver TJ Moore, who, at least me personally, I think he is made for that kind of boundary role that's pushing the ball down the field. You have a guy in Troy Stellato who can absolutely cook, has a nice frame. He certainly could be that guy. I'd sprinkle in Brian Westco too. I mean, there are wide receivers that I look at and say the physical traits, the physical capabilities, they're certainly there. Now it's just about these wide receivers putting it together and being those vertical threats for this Clemson offense. And if you get one of these wide receivers or a couple of these wide receivers to really be threats down the field, I think it opens up the middle of the field for guys like Jake Bringenstool. I think it certainly helps that run game become a little bit more effective because safeties can't just climb into the box and try to stop the run. I think that's a massive storyline for this Clemson offense going into number 3. And it's, can the offensive line, and I misspelled stay, that's a mess up. Can the offensive line stay consistent? And what I mean by that is you go back and look at the offensive line in 2023, you had spot players that played really well, and you had some guys that stayed healthy. But outside of that, you had a lot of just kind of shuffling around, right? Putnam and Blake Miller were really the only 2 players that, started for a long time at the same position. The rest of it was kind of just a mix and match. And you look at some of the elite offensive lines that we saw in 2023, a lot of it was because they just had a solid 5-man rotation that stayed healthy the whole year, and they kind of built that chemistry up. You look at the Clemson offensive line, and whether it was Mitch Mays, whether it was Harris Sewell, you look at Mitch Mays, he played a lot of football. He was a liability for Clemson every time he was out on the field. They just didn't have a consistent starting 5 that stayed healthy the whole year. And that's really important. You can have 3 really good offensive linemen that hold it down, but if the other 2 are not playing good football, the offensive line as a whole is probably not playing very good. You have to have a starting 5 that stays healthy, that stays together, and kind of just builds that chemistry throughout a year. And I look back at that Clemson offensive line and just say, again, you had some guys that played some good football, guys like Blake Miller, Putnam on the inside, but they didn't have enough guys that stayed healthy and stayed consistent all year for Clemson. I think the last question on offense, and you guys can see kind of the pattern here, is a lot of questions on the offensive side of the football. Now, the last question I have is the running back room, and it has nothing to do with the starter. I look at Phil Moffitt and say I think he's one of the best running backs in the ACC. I think more my question was, what's the depth look like? And I'm going to throw out my guy. I'll ask the Clemson fans, too, to let me know in the comments section, who do you think steps up in that running back room to be that running back number 2 behind Phil Moffitt? I'm going to go with the true freshman, David Azumne. Now, I think I said that name right. I love this kid out of high school. We broke him down. This was about a year and a half ago when we broke down that commitment. 6'1", 205 pounds, runs a 10.8 in the 100-meter dash. Not many running backs come in as physically put together as David does. And then do you have like the size, but you also have the straight line speed. I mean, this is a guy that has the physical traits to play year one. Phil Maffa is your starting running back. You need a running back 2 and 3 that provides depth, that lets Phil Maffa stay fresh. Who's going to be that running back? I think it very well could be the true freshman in that running back room to emerge. Now, the last question I have, and you go to the defensive side of the football and say, not many question marks there. I think it's one of the best defensive lines we see in the country, one of the best linebacker rooms we see in the country, and one of the best secondaries in the country. Although it's young in the secondary, these players, Avian Terrell, guys like Fagan as a true freshman, they can play. Now, I think the big question I have on the defensive side of the football is the edge room and the depth, right? You look at the starters and say TJ Parker and Peter Woods, that might be one of the better edge duos that we see in all of the country. What's going to be behind them? You look at historically some of the best defenses in the country. You look historically at these Clemson defenses. They didn't only have NFL caliber starters, but they had really quality depth too. They had the ability to rotate that defensive line throughout 4 quarters, throughout 12 plus games, and keep everybody fresh. That is one of the key parts of having an elite defensive line. You look on the inside, say Peyton Page, Capehart, Trey Williams, potentially true freshman Vic Burley, Peter Woods maybe kicking down in again to the inside, and say the depth on the inside of the defensive line, that is certainly there. The depth at the edge rusher position, you have some question marks about. This has been one of the biggest questions we've had for this Clemson program. That being said, we kind of got some answers during the spring game because you saw A.J. Hoffler as a sophomore play some really good football. You saw Jaheim Lawson play some really good football. You saw Zaire Patterson, a former top 100 national recruit. He also played some good football. And that's kind of the epitome of this Clemson program. You have these guys stay within the program like Zaire Patterson, who might not have stepped on campus and kind of lived up to that top 100 national ranking, but he stayed within the program, kind of trusted the process. If he can emerge as a quality edge rusher for Clemson, that's a massive storyline because, again, you look at the starters and say, we feel damn good about TJ Parker and Peter Woods. Again, that might be one of the best edge rushing duos that we see in the country. What's your third edge rusher? What's your fourth edge rusher? What's your fifth edge rusher? You look back at Michigan, they had 4 guys that they rotated pretty much evenly, and it made that Michigan defensive line really, really dangerous. Is Clemson going to have that ability in 2024? I think it has a lot to do with guys like A.J. Hoffler, Jaheim Lawson stepping up in this 2024 year, but guys that certainly showed what they could do in the 2020 or in the spring game in 2024. So we'll see how that unit looks as well. Those are my big question marks. And again, if you start getting some answers to these questions, specifically those first 2, can the Garrett Riley offense kind of find its footing in year 2? Can a wide receiver break out as a vertical threat? This Clemson team is probably my pick to win the ACC. But those things need to happen first. A fascinating team for this Clemson program heading into 2024. Really excited about it. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later. Peace.